Okay, right, we'll make a start. Just to sort of remind people, technically we start at quarter past now. So hence why I've kind of left you waiting a little bit. But I assume everyone who is here is in the game. If not, you can join midway through. So let's make a start so we get through everything today. I'm just checking, can everybody actually hear me? Because a few people said they can't hear anything. Okay, I'll take that as a yes. Let's make a start. So the first half of these questions are about the keywords that you should have done for homework. So we're looking for words that mean sudden or unexpected, done quickly without warning. Hopefully, most of you will have done the homework. Nice. Okay, I can see half you have. Okay, a word that means severe mental or physical pain, extreme distress, or suffering. Oh, nice. Yeah, it is anguish. Okay, not clear or understandable, lacking logical connection. Is it vivid, reclusive, incoherent, or inexplicable? Hey, only three people got this. It's incoherent. Okay, if something is unable to be explained, it is inexplicable, tumultuous, incoherent, or abrupt. Nice. Quite a few people got that one. Okay. Full of confusion, noise, and disorder involving strong emotions or great disturbance. Is it anguish, tumultuous, abrupt, or vivid? Nice. Most people got this one. Avoiding the company of others or living in isolation. So anguish, reclusive, tumult, or inexplicable. Nice, it is reclusive. So if someone is a recluse, it means that they live in isolation. Okay, if something is very clear, bright, or detailed, creating strong mental images. Nice. Okay. I think these next three are words that shouldn't be new to us. They're from our original set of words. So see if you can remember back. A word that means excessive confidence or boldness or audacity. It is temerity. Nice. Okay, done quietly to avoid being noticed. Stealthy, linger, macabre, or voracious. Nice. Okay, very careful and precise. Only three people got this one. It is meticulous. Okay, that concludes the first half of this quiz. So the first half has all been about defining what should be hopefully not new words to us by now. Now, the next 11 questions are all to do with what we've kind of done last week and the week before, thinking about symbolism, connotation in terms of similes, metaphors, and personification. So, for example, her smile is like the sun. What deeper meaning might this simile suggest about her smile? That's meant to say she likes sunny weather. My typo there. Nice. It is that her smile is bright and warm. So if we're looking for deeper meanings, we're looking for things that aren't the literal interpretation. So you all spotted that. Nice. The city was a jungle. What does this metaphor suggest about the city? So look for the thing that isn't a literal interpretation. Go beyond. When you think of jungles, what do you think of? Nice. It is dangerous and chaotic. So you should have had that association that when you think of jungles, it's full of wild animals. What do they represent? Disorder and chaos. His words cut like a knife. What does the simile suggest about his words? Wow, I'm making lots of typos this evening. It's meant to say polite. Well done. They were powerful and hurtful. The moon watched over the sleeping city. What does the personification suggest about the moon? It has eyes, it's a protective force, it's frightening, or it's lonely. Nice, it is a protective force. One person went for frightening. Lonely, I can kind of understand, but the one that we're looking for is a protective force. Hope is a fragile bird. What does this metaphor suggest about hope? So break it down. What do you associate with birds? What do you associate with being fragile? Nice, most people got this. It can fly away easily and be lost. So when I think about birds, I think of what can they do. Their one key defining trait is that they can fly. So I will put two and two together. Like hope, it might metaphorically fly away, get away from us. Oh, my love's like a red, red rose that's newly sprung in June. What does the rose symbolize about his love? It's newly sprung in June. What might it represent? Okay, so most people got it right. It's fresh and passionate. But it seems to be almost 50-50 split with his love is temporary. Um, I wouldn't have gone with temporary because of the words newly sprung. I think that suggests rebirth and life. I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high over vales and hills. What might the cloud symbolize? Think about this idea of loneliness. Nice, most people got this. He's isolated and detached. Okay. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. What does the personification suggest about death? Ooh, so most people went for trickster. Quite a pessimistic view of this quote. I would have focused more on the idea of the kindness. Almost to me suggests that death is not something to be scared of. But I can see why you would go for trickster. So we beat on boats against the current. What does this metaphor suggest about their experience? So they're being compared to boats against a current. What does that make you think of? Nice. Yeah, I think it showed determination. Like a boat trying to overcome the force of the wave almost suggests the struggle and the determination to overcome struggle. Okay, Macon was an old town, but it was a tired old town. What does this personification suggest about the town? Lovely. So the town feels worn down and weary, reflecting the people's slow lives. Okay, last question. The clock marched mercilessly. What does this personification suggest about time? Ooh, a split. So some people went with time moves quickly. I put this in as a little curveball because I think I would allow that as a good answer, but I think the higher level answer is the time is relentless and oppressive. I think the mercilessly, I think, is what would sway me to this answer. So if you're acting without mercy, it suggests that you're quite oppressive. Okay, let's see who's won. Nice. Well done. Okay, right. Let's get on with what we're going to do today. So we have been looking recently at, well, last week, personification, metaphors, and similes and how to analyze those. Today, we're going to focus on something slightly different, something that you might not have done before. And it's this idea of phonetics. So, just to remind you, we're dealing with language, and language is the choice of words that a writer makes. And that's the theme of what we've been looking at over the past few weeks, and we're going to continue to look at this today. So, just to remind you, word choices are specific. They're made specifically to make you feel and think a certain way, and they have an effect on the reader. Very much in the same way that if you get wet, it's caused by the rain. If we eat lots of sugar, the effect is that our teeth might get cavities. So we're going to continue to look at this cause and effect relationship today and how language can affect the reader. Now, we've focused a lot on this idea of connotations and symbolism, how words can represent deeper things. And I think the quiz today has really showed how well you're starting to grasp this. Because words don't just have literal meanings, they can have figurative ones as well, based on our associations to those words. So we've looked at examples like home before. Yes, on a literal level, it's a house. But what might it represent? Well, I might associate it with warmth, comfort, a feeling of belonging. Same with the snake. Yes, it's literally a dangerous predator, but it might symbolize this idea of fear, danger. Same with symbolism. A rose might represent something beyond itself. So I might associate it with love and beauty. And then a storm I might associate with conflict, turmoil, change. Now, I kind of want to continue with this a little bit today, but slightly skewed. We're going to move away from whole words because what we've looked at recently is a lot of whole words. So how do we have associations about certain words? But today I want to focus on sounds. So when I say phonetics, I'm just relating to the sound that a word makes. So writers don't only choose words for their meanings, they also choose them for their sounds. Sounds themselves can carry emotional weight, imply tone, or create atmosphere. We associate certain sounds with certain emotions and experiences. So often writers make specific choices about which letters to use. And I've highlighted this idea of mimicking the experience they want you to feel. And you'll sort of see what I mean in a second. So we associate certain sounds with experiences in the same way that we associate certain things to words. So you might hear a certain sound and it might make you think of a certain thing or feel a certain way. And writers play on this. They pick letters very specifically to mimic the experience that they want you to feel. So some sounds naturally feel soft, smooth, some feel harsh, some feel aggressive, and writers use this to enhance the mood and the meaning of their writing. So we're going to look at this a bit more specifically. I appreciate that you might not have done this in school, but it's definitely something it's a higher level skill, but it's worth looking at. So, for example, you might get soft, gentle sounds, things like your L's, your M's, your N, your S, your W's. When you say those letters, they sound quite gentle. There's no aggression to them. They're quite smooth in their delivery. So if we're thinking about biology a little bit, why do they feel soft? Well, when we speak them, they're produced with a lot of air. And sometimes we talk them with a relaxed position of the tongue. And so naturally, they just have this relaxing sound. They're easy to speak and they just generally sound soothing. So example words might be like lull, mellow, whisper, silky, things that are quite easy to say. And the effect that this could create is it's mimicking this idea of calm and peace because they're gentle and soft to say. So because we associate them with being soft, the effect is also that they appear calm and peaceful and gentle. Alternatively, you might have quite harsh, sharp sounds. So K, C, T, V, F. Already, I hope you can hear a difference. L compared to T. The harsh, sharp sounds are very fast in the way that you say them. And they feel fast because when you say them biologically, air gets trapped when we try and pronounce these letters. And so that you get this jagged sound. So your K, K, T, F, V. All the ones, you see patterns, letters that sound similar within similar groups. So example words might be crash, kick, clash, crack, fight. All of these that have quite jagged, harsh sounds to them. So the effect that this creates is something quite aggressive and forceful because it's almost mimicking this feeling of harshness and tension. And then very similar, you might get quite forceful, energetic sounds. So your b, p, w, d, g. All those sounds that sound very similar. And the reason they feel forceful is because, again, when you biologically pronounce them, they use the same parts of your lips and jaw in order to pronounce the words. So the sound comes out as quite a bold sound. Notice when I say b, my lips go together. P, w, d. All of them use my lips in a similar way. So example words might be bash, blow, whack, war. And all of them suggest violence and action and power. So you can have quite gentle, soft sounds, quite sharp sounds, and then quite forceful sounds. And I can link these into groups that all have names. And this is I really want to reinforce this idea. This is quite a high level skill. So when it comes to GCSE, these are the sorts of analyses that only the really high level students will do. Most people don't even pick up on things like this. So I wanted to introduce you to it early so we can get ahead of this. So we can group them with names. First one is a sibilant sound, and all these are sort of your S and your Z sounds, so sh sounds, the ones that sound really soft. And again, they biologically feel this way because you've got the passing of air almost creating a hissing sound. It's quite a soft sound. And we tend to use these kinds of words when we want to create a sort of sneaky or sinister effect, something that's quite soft. So example words could be sizzle, hiss, slither, whisper. All the sounds that have a sort of elongated S sound are sibilant sounds. And depending on the context, they either tend to be quite gentle and sort of are quite calming, or they might suggest something sinister. So you tend to really only get one or the other for sibilant sounds, calming or sinister. You also get fricative sounds. So these are the sort of harsh pronounced letters, your f, v, k, and t sounds. They're all described as fricative. And the way that I remember that is because all these letters are in the word of what they're called. So F, the fricative, V is in the word, C is in the word, T is in the word. So all the fricative letters are within the word fricative, is how I remember them. And the effect that they have is something quite harsh. And we tend to use them to add tension to writing. For example, flick, wave, thorn, shuffle, all those sorts of words that are quite harsh. And then we also get plosive sounds. So these are our hard-hitting words, the ones that convey violence. So our p, b, d, g. I didn't mean to put t and k in there, but they're quite forceful and energetic, almost aggressive in a way. So if they're used by a writer, it tends to convey this idea of aggression. So bang, crash, kick, drop, clap. All words that anyway you would associate with force, but naturally now they've got a phonetic association to force as well. So sibilant is the S sounds, fricative are the harsh sounds, and plosive are the energetic, violent sounds. You also get these three, but I don't want to focus too much on these ones as much today. But you get nasals, which you got M, N sort of sounds. Because when you pronounce them, they kind of come from the air kind of moves through your nose when you say them, hence why they're called nasal. So things like murmur, moon, longing, all the ones where the sounds come from here in the nose. You get lateral or liquid sounds, the more L sounds, the R sounds, the ones where the airflow goes around the tongue when we say them. So lull, roll, ripple. And then we also get our gliding sounds as well, our W's and our Y's. And they tend to create quite a soft, flowing, often gentle and whispery effect, such as wave, yes, yellow. But I'd focus mainly on these first three because these are the ones that really have the big effect. Okay, so as a bit of a checkpoint, a little bit of the quiz. So in the chat, I want you to think about what word types these might be from the six that I've introduced you to. Our sibilant ones, our S's, our fricative, our FVCT, our plosive sounds. What kind of words might these be? I'll let you just have a minute to think about that and then put some answers in the chat, please. So start with whisper. What kind of word might whisper be? What sound do you hear there as the prominent sound of that word? The whisper. Someone put S sound. Lovely. If you've got an S sound, what's that going to be? Yep, someone says sibilant. It's a lovely sibilant word, the whisper. It's the S that really dominates that sound. What about a crack? I've just given you the answer if you saw them, but what about cracks? If I said I was like cracking a whip or I was cracking some chocolate, I think about the C and the K sort of sounds. They're very harsh sounds. The one that I would go for here is the fricative ones. I'd focus on the K sounds, the crack K. They're quite harsh. What about a murmur? The ones that had an M sound to it. This one here is our nasal one. It's kind of dominated by the M sound, where all the sound comes through the nose. Nice. What about the sliver then? What might sliver be? Again, we've got this S sound. Nice one said sibilant. What about flow? Flow is a bit of a weird one. What's the dominant sound of this word, you think? I'd maybe think about the L, the flow. Think about the L. What's that L? Yeah, I would go with that as well. I think it's our liquid sounds. It's the possibly the gliding with the W as well. What about bang? We got our B and our G sounds. That's quite a hard-hitting, violent sound. What was that one? Think about what B and G were as sounds. Cool, got some right answers. If we've got a B and a G sounds, it's our plosive sounds. The ones that are really hard hitting, that are violent in nature. B and G are plosive sounds. What about flick? Again, focus on we've got an F and we've got a CK sound. Think about the F and the C and the K for this one. Yep, someone said it's fricative. Nice. And then finally, ripple. What might our ripple be? Think again, we've got an R and we've got an L sound that kind of dominate the word, the ripple. Cool. It is our liquid. So these are what I would have gone for here. And again, I want to reiterate, this is a higher level skill. It takes practice to gauge what types of words these are. But it's really important because writers, you wouldn't think it, but they do make these very specific choices about sound to get you to think and feel a certain way. And next week, we're going to continue looking at this in terms of alliteration, assonance, and consonants. So it does apply to language techniques and onomatopoeia as well. All apply this here. So I also want to quickly remind you, we also looked at the effect on the reader. And I gave you a few weeks ago, and I reintroduced it to you last week, a way to write about how something affects the reader. And I gave you this acronym here of FALTS. I won't test you on it again. I just wanted to remind you of it really quickly. But sometimes people struggle with how to articulate the effect on the reader. So one way to explain the effect of writer's words is to choose a precise verb to make the effect clear. By working through these verbs, you can really unpick the effect of language in detail, adding layers of analysis to your comments and writing. So how does a word make you feel? What does it make you ask? Does it help you to understand anything? Does it link to themes or wider ideas? Does it make you think a certain way? Or does it make you sympathize with anything in any way? So I've introduced you very quickly to phonetics, and we're going to come back to this in a second. But I also want to introduce you to a second language device, and it is tone. Now, tone is the attitude or the mood in a piece of writing. It's not just about what is said, it's about how it's said. So, for example, if I was having a conversation with you and I said, Um, oh wow, you're doing really good. And then a second time I said to you, wow, you're doing really good. I've said the same thing to you, but the way that I've said it is different. And so that difference is the tone. Um, and the tone conveys very different things. So it's not just about what is said, it's about how the writer is saying it, conveys different things to you. Because if I said those two things to you, you'd feel differently depending on how I said it to you. So we're going to look at tone today, and how writers create tone is by using these sounds and the choice of words that they make. So, for example, the sun shimmered over the calm sea. Notice we've got these sort of sibilant S sounds. The sun shimmered over the calm sea. Creates quite a peaceful and calm vibe. Whereas if I used more plosive sounds, like the fricative sounds, the storm smashed through the village, has a very different effect to if I said it shimmered. It's very different. The sounds are different, and so it makes you think and feel different ways. And so we can use phonetics in the way that we make someone feel. But I really want to quickly just clear something up because tone is different to atmosphere. Last week, I introduced you to atmosphere. And the atmosphere is just the mood or the overall emotion that is created by the writing. So if atmosphere is the mood that's created, the tone is how that mood is created. So different tones can lead to different atmospheres because the atmosphere is the mood that's created. It's the overall way that you're made to feel. But the tone is the way in which you're made to feel that way. So the tone is the author or speaker's attitude, as we discussed, created through word choice, sounds, and then the atmosphere is the overall emotion that's created. So, for example, I can't believe this is happening. The tone to me there is one of frustration. If I was shouting this thing, I'd think about how I would say it. What would I be feeling to make me shout this thing? So, thinking about frustration and being shocked. That's the way I would almost describe tone. Think about why you would be saying these things. How would you be feeling if you were in the character's shoes? So she smiled gently at the child. To me, that's got quite a soft tone, almost quite kind and calm. So very different tones created. Okay. So I very quickly also just want to go over what do we actually learn from the tone of the writing and why it's important. So we can learn so much from looking at the tone of the writing and how something is said. It often reveals how the writer feels about a subject. So if this was non-fiction writing, factual writing, the tone might reveal how they feel about a subject. So, for example, I can't believe this is happening. Again, to me, conveys frustration and shock. Sometimes it might also teach you the mood that the writer wants you to experience yourself. It can often influence, like I said, the atmosphere that's created, even if subtly. So the candle flickered in the empty room. To me, that's quite a uneasy tone. It makes me feel quite unsettled. And I think the reason that is because the sounds again. It might also tell you more about a character. We discussed a few weeks ago about this idea of subtext, that you can't always take things on face value. And sometimes tone is quite a good way of understanding how characters are actually thinking and feeling beyond what they actually say. Because someone can say something without meaning it exactly. So tone can hint at a character's personality, opinions, or intentions. For example, he laughed, but it wasn't a kind laugh. The tone there is clearly something that's quite cruel, almost bitter, sarcastic. And then it can also give us perspective and context. So it helps the readers to understand how the writer views events, themes, or ideas. For example, history repeats itself, as always. I think adding that as always, to me, just something quite cynical or almost resigned. So I think the tone is really important. So again, I just want to stress to you, tone and atmosphere influence how the reader is affected. They are created by the reader's ability to infer something from the connotations of certain words and sounds. It's the use of other language techniques that provides the connotations. So that's why this week is a bit different, because it's not really about the connotations of words anymore. It's about the sounds and the way that it makes you feel. So tone and atmosphere are at the basis of how the writing makes us feel and determine what we take away from the story and what we think about the characters. Tone is the mood that's conveyed. Atmosphere is the emotion or feeling a reader is made to feel. Tone tells us a lot about how characters feel and what they are thinking. It conveys a lot of subtext. And again, I've just given you some examples of tones that you might find in stories. These are not the only tones, these are just some examples of tones. There is loads of tones. And like I said last week with atmosphere, if you can justify your opinion, it's correct. So if you want to take them, they can. They're just there for inspiration to you. And again, some inspiration for how tones affect the reader. I'm not going to go through these. Again, these are just examples that are there to help you if you ever need them. It's always worth just going over these for revision. But I want to focus on today's questions. So I've left you the examples of tones on the right. And I've picked from this list for these questions anyway. So in the chat, I want you to start thinking about what tone is being created by these sentences. What does the writer want, or how is the writer trying to make you feel a certain way? So I can't wait to show you what I made. If you were to say that, why would you be saying that? What emotional state would you be in if you were shouting this? Have a look at the list and try and think in the chat. So someone said enthusiastic and proud. Lovely. I would agree. I think this is enthusiasm. I think the things that tell me that are that I can't wait to show you what I made. The exclamatory sentence and the fact that I can't wait. I think it does show enthusiasm. Absolutely. Optimism, playful, enthusiastic, keen. All of these are lovely. What about why did you leave the door open again? What kind of tone is that? Frustration, someone straight in there. Nice. Frustration is the one I would have gone for also. I think the things that tell you that, I think you can imagine how this would be said. I think it's the again that really solidifies the frustration. She watched the rain fall alone on the empty street. What kind of tone would that be? Someone said boredom, possibly. Lonely, yeah, I think that's nice. Lonely is definitely right. I think, yeah, I think lonely. I think melancholic, something sad, definitely within the negative, dark tones of this section. Absolutely. Yeah, someone said depression. Absolutely great. So something moved in the shadows. What kind of tone is being created there? Oh, someone said tense. Someone else said mysterious. Yeah, I think these are all great. I would have also gone for tense and mysterious, maybe even suspenseful. Yep, ominous, mysterious. Yep, all of these are great. The sun warmed the quiet garden as birds sang softly. What about that one? Someone said joyful. Someone said relaxing. Nice. I'm liking these so far. Peaceful. Someone else said peaceful. Yep, these are the ones that I would have gone for. Yep, you all absolutely nailed this. So enthusiastic, frustrated, melancholic and sad, mysterious, suspenseful, calm, peaceful. That's not to say that they are the only answers. As long as you can justify your answer, there is no wrong answer in how something makes you feel. Okay, we'll do a few more just to really check, but then I want to move on. Let's just do the first three. So part of me wanted to stay, but I knew I had to leave. Someone said nostalgic. Someone said given up. Someone said apprehensive. Well, apprehensive would be quite a nice one. I don't think it's on the list, but that would be quite a nice one. Someone said matter of fact, bitter. Yeah, I think there's definitely some conflict here. So I maybe would have gone for conflicted for this one, showing some sort of internal struggle because they wanted to stay, but they knew they had to leave. I think there's that conflict of interest there. What about I should have expected nothing less from them? Oh, someone said ambivalent for number six. Oh, it's a lovely one. What about number seven? I should have expected nothing less of you. Someone said cold. Yeah, definitely cold. Anything else? Someone said bitter, conflict, mean, bitter again. Yep, I would have gone for that. So these are the ones that I would have gone for. So looking back, I realized things could have been different. I think that's kind of reflective. I remember the summers we spent by the river, laughing until sunset. I think that's quite nostalgic. And she held her certificate high. A small smile of triumph on her face conveys pride to me. But I think you've smashed it. So I want to link the idea of phonetics that we looked at to tone. And think about some of these examples. So which phonetic sounds give the tones? We looked at six different types of phonetic sounds. Trying to think back. I know everyone just learned them, but is there any that you can remember that you can see in here? Because there are multiple in here. Is there anything here that might influence the tone of this? So thinking purely about the phonetic sounds, so the sibilant, the plosive, the fricative, the nasal, the liquid sounds, and the gliding sounds. Is there any of those in here that you can spot? Someone said glides. I think there is some nice glides in here. I think there's definitely a W sound. The glow is definitely in here. The valley, yeah, these glide sounds are absolutely in here. These are ones I would have gone for. I think there's a few of these in here. The sibilant sounds like the sunset, the casting. There's definitely those gliding semi-vowels. There's those glow sounds. And then there's also some liquids in here with the hills, the valley, the golden, all that sort of thing. And I think the effects that they have are to create an overall quite soft and soothing tone. Something's definitely more positive in nature. Um, Okay, what about the wind howled through the trees, shaking their branches violently? How is a tense and ominous tone created in the use of phonetics here? Is there any sounds that you can see or hear? Someone said plosive. Yeah, there's definitely plosive. There's some branches here. There's howled. Anything else in here? Because there's multiple. Someone said fricative. There's definitely fricative in here. There's through the trees, the shaking. Yep, these are the ones that I went for. So I think there's T, K, and V sounds, which to me are quite harsh again, quite turbulent. And there's definitely some plosives. There's a W, there's a D, and there's a B. Wind, howled, branches suggest force and impact. So linking back to what I said before, they mimic the sounds and the experiences that they want you to feel. So the wind howling through the trees suggests that it's quite strong. And so you're going to want to use sounds like plosives, the ones that are strong, the ones that convey strength and power. Okay, we'll skip this and move on to the next. Okay, we've done phonetics. What tone is being created here, do you think? So think about the phonetics, think about what sounds there are in here, but also think about the tone that is created here. So how does this writing make you feel? Someone said nasals. I think there is in there. I think there's a more, definitely. It definitely could be nasal. Someone said melancholy. Possibly, if you can justify it. I think about there's a lot of F sounds, C, T, um, T, C, K, K again, T, T. There's a lot of those sounds. What were those? Was a fricative? There's definitely fricative sounds in here, which were harsh. So we need to think about the harshness. I said, to me, I think it's quite eerie, almost mysterious or suspenseful. And the reason I said that is there are a lot of sort of softer sibilant sounds compared with the more harsh fricative sounds. And so to me, that suggests something mysterious, almost suspenseful. She gently traced the letters of the old letter, feeling a warmth from memories long past. What kind of tone is created here? Someone said reunited. That's quite a nice way of thinking about it. Someone said joy, glide, sibilants, nasals. There's definitely the sibilants and the S sounds, the past, the glides with the warmth, nice. So yeah, that's what I went for. I think it's something quite reflective, quite nostalgic, almost calm in the way this is said. And I think the reason that is someone said nasals, and you also get these sort of long vowel sounds as well. But I think it definitely creates quite a thoughtful mood that evokes reflection and nostalgia. Okay, we'll do one more and then we'll move on. What tone has been created here? Lightning split the sky and the rain lashed against the windows without mercy. What sounds make you think about the tone? How is this being said? Also, to any Key Stage 4 students that have joined, we officially now start at 8:15, but you're welcome to stay for the remainder of the last 10 minutes here. So, yep, what kind of sounds are made here? Someone said violent. There's definitely violent sounds. Sibilant, plosive. Someone said evil, power, doom, mystery. Yep, so I went definitely violent, something dramatic and tense to me. And I think the reason that is you get these really harsh plosives and the fricatives. So you get the split, the P sound, the plosive here. You get the sky, the K fricative sound, the lashed, the plosive D there, the plosive G, the fricative T, the D, again, the T. All of these are definitely harsh, hard-hitting sounds, which mimic this idea of violence and drama. Okay, so the last thing I want to do is, again, keep thinking about this idea. But in your GCSEs, the higher level skill is thinking about what we could actually learn about certain characters in their descriptions. So, taking what we've just done, thinking about the tones and the atmospheres that are created by the sounds, I now want to think about what we can learn about characters. So, for example, how is the reader made to feel about the raven from this quote? Open here I flung the shutter, when with many a flirt and flutter, in there stepped a stately raven of the saintly days of yore. Is there any sort of sounds in here that create certain tones that influence how you feel about this raven? Because this is really a higher level skill that we're doing, but I really want to see if you can see what you come up with for this. What's the effect on the reader? What does it make you think about the raven? It is a bit of a hard quote. Someone said sympathetic. Why does it make you sympathetic for the raven? Someone said plosives. There's definitely a lot of harsh sounds in here. Open. I flung. Also think about these again. We've got these FT, 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 T. A lot of T sounds in here. What were they? So there's a shutter, flirt, flutter. They're all fricative sounds. They're all very violent sounds, aren't they? What kind of tone might be created by those very violent sounds? Because this is really what I want you to get you thinking about. If you've got violent sounds, What does that therefore suggest about the raven? Does it make you feel any way about the raven if there's these violent sounds? Some said anxiety. Lovely. That's a nice way of thinking about it. Miserable. To me, I think this is what I went with. I think focus on those fricatives because I think to me that's quite suspenseful because it's almost suggesting that the raven is almost quite violent. It's almost otherworldly in the way that it's presented. The harshness of the description definitely, in me anyway, creates a bit of unsettling. It's quite an unsettling feeling, quite an unsettling description. Almost quite poetic in a way, the flirt and flutter, the stately raven. Yeah, anything to do with aggression is good. What can we learn about the character from this tone? Look on my works, ye mighty and despair. What can we learn about this character? What about his personality traits from the sounds that are there? Okay. I just want to reiterate, if you come for Key Stage 4 GCSE, we start at 8:15 now. This is still the Key Stage 3 session. But you're welcome to stay for these 10 minutes. Okay, so this is what I went with. I think there's a lot of fricative and plosive sounds in this. The look, my works, mighty, despair. There's a lot of powerful sounds in here, which should mimic the power that this character feels, almost portraying him as quite proud and domineering, possibly arrogant in the way that he behaves. And I think that's suggested by the powerful sounds that are there. Okay, the last one we will do then, and then you're free for the evening, is I was glad to be rid of the widow and the parson. What kind of tone is created here through these sounds that are there? Think about the G, the D sound there, the D sound there, the P. What kind of sounds were they? Someone said hop. Oh, someone said relieved. That's what I was looking for. There's definitely a sense of relief here. Someone said hope even. Lovely. See, this one, people are getting it. This is good. Fricative plosive sibilants. Yeah, I think it was hit on the head with relief. I think relief is the tone that I would best fit to this quote. And I think the things that tell me that are those plosive sounds. The glad, to be rid of the widow, the parson. Almost quite hard-hitting, forceful sounds that highlight the character's sense of release that he feels. It's like when you breathe out and you can just release all that tension. And there's also some nasal sounds in there as well, the was and the widow, that are a bit softer to sort of emphasize the relief and the ease that this character now feels. And to me, the effect is that it shows the character's joy at escaping the figures that he was trying to escape. The reader senses his youthful independence. So yeah, that's what I would have gone for. Okay, right. That is the Key Stage 3 done for this week. Um, yeah, thank you for coming. I'll stay. We've got 5 minutes until Key Stage 4 GCSE begins. So if you have any questions, I'm here for 5 minutes. Otherwise, you're welcome to stay for the Key Stage 4 session. I know this has been a bit difficult this week. It's definitely something that we've not done before, but it's something that will be very useful to you in the future for those higher level skills. This week, I'm not going to give you any homework. We've already done a Kahoot. We did one at the start, just under an hour ago. So we've moved the sessions now from It was 7 till 9, with the key stage 4 being 8 till 9. It's now 8:15 to 9:15. And I know that's quite late, but it's purely because we had sessions before this and it was a bit difficult to get started by 7. So if you can bear with me to 9:15, I would appreciate. But otherwise, sessions are recorded if you want to go back to them at a later date. If you don't want to stay that late, that's completely understandable because it is very late. Okay. So yeah, we'll give it a few more minutes so more people can join. But again, I want to reiterate to you, 8:15 to 9:15 it is now. But again, they are recorded, so you don't have to stay as late. So someone says, will we only focus on spelling, punctuation, and grammar and comprehension for this term, or we also do a novel? Is that for the Key Stage 3 session? Because I'm thinking of continuing with fiction for a little bit just to help get the analysis skills up. And then I haven't decided what we're going to do yet. So if you think a novel would be helpful, what novel do you have in mind? Because we can do a novel. I was thinking of moving on to some non-fiction sort of spoken skills. So yeah, for Key Stage 3, I've not decided yet, unfortunately. For Key Stage 4, we're doing Inspector Calls for a few months. Right. Give me a few more minutes for people to join. Oh, shit. Just can everyone hear me? All right. For some reason, the camera has crashed. I don't know why. But if everyone can hear me, we can still continue. I'll just speak without a face. Cool. Yeah, I don't know why the camera's crashed. Sorry, guys. That was random. Okay, so just a quick answer your questions before we start with Key Stage 4 then. Someone said, what exam board does an inspector calls normally come on? So that is Edexcel and AQA. Although I do think it might come on others as well. Someone said, will we do a Christmas Carol? No, that's not something I'm going to be covering this year. I'm going to be covering inspector calls and then we'll move on to poetry, do some English language. And then if we have time, I will do a Jekyll and Hyde right at the very end. Okay, cool. Right, I'll make a start then if you can actually hear me. I apologize, I've got no camera. So you wanted me to do an inspector calls. Now, like with Macbeth, I thought the best place to start was with context, because we need to understand what was going on at the time that this play was written in order to understand why it was written. So I want to briefly remind you, as of last week, we did this. We looked at exam technique. Context comes under AO3. And this accounts for 6 out of 30 of your marks on this Inspector Calls question. And just to remind ourselves, AO3 is about showing understanding of the context in which the text was written, and therefore its impact on the meaning of the text. So AO3 asks you to link the text to its social, historical, and cultural context. And the key words here are to show a deeper understanding, show that you can really pick apart a text. So that's what we're going to do today. So this will measure how students understand the relationship between the text and the context in which they were written. This includes relevant historical, social, and biographical information. Note that the key word here is relevant. So that was from AQA themselves. Okay, but first, I'm very much aware that some people would not have finished Inspector Calls yet. So I want to do a very brief plot summary, just so that we're all on the same page about what actually happens in this play. And it's going to be very brief. So it's split into 3 acts. Act 1, the play opens with a celebration. The Burling family are celebrating the engagement of their daughter Sheila to Gerald Croft. Mr. Burling makes a very ironic speech about business. Except the inspector arrives to question the family, and he tells the family about a girl called Eva Smith, who was violently committed suicide by drinking bleach just 2 hours before this celebration occurs. And he brings with him the picture of Eva Smith, the girl. Now, he begins to interrogate the characters. And if you remember back, and if you've read this play, he does it one by one. And the first person that he interrogates is Mr. Burling, who reveals that he sacked Eva Smith from her job at his factory for being the ringleader to girls who wanted higher wages. Okay, and that's where Act 1 ends. I told you this was going to be brief. So, the inspector then reveals at the beginning of Act 2 that Eva had no family to turn to after being sacked by Mr. Burling. And so he then turns his attention to Sheila, who is deeply affected by this news. Because once she was sacked from the factory, Eva had found another job at a department store. But Sheila reveals that she had complained about Eva Smith for being rude to her when she wasn't. And this caused Eva to get fired from her job. So after being sacked, Eva changes her name to Daisy Renton and runs into Gerald at a bar. Now, he admits that he had an affair with Daisy and that he tried to give her money. And at this point, Sheila returns the engagement ring to Gerald, and their engagement is broken off. Now, Act 2 doesn't end there, because after we deal with Gerald Croft, the attention is turned to Mrs. Burling, who 2 weeks before committing suicide, Eva Smith had turned to Mrs. Burling for help, because Mrs. Burling ran a charity that supported young girls in need. Daisy had introduced herself as Mrs. Burling, which the real Mrs. Burling hated. So Daisy was sent away without help. So we've seen how each of the characters so far has done something to the same girl. Okay. I've done this in the wrong order. But Act 3 then, the end of this play. Eric is the last to be interrogated. He admits that he had got Daisy pregnant, and he is very ashamed of this act. Now, he admits to the inspector that he has a drinking problem and that he did pressure her into doing it. They both knew that marriage wasn't an option, so Eric gives her money that he stole from Mr. Burling's factory. And the inspector leaves after giving a very passionate speech about social responsibility. So, up until this point, all of the family have been interrogated and questioned about how they knew Eva Smith. And each of them reveals that they've done something to wrong her in some way. So the play is about finding out who's responsible for her unaliving herself. So the play ends like this. The family begin to question the inspector's how genuine the inspector is. As Gerald meets the real police officer outside of the house, and the real police officer says that there's no Inspector Gould on the force. And so Mr. Burling rings the police sergeant, who also supports this, that there is no Inspector Gould on the police force. So to confirm this even further, Gerald rings the infirmary, who confirm that no one called Eva Smith committed suicide there tonight. And so the family assume it's all a joke. Except Eric and Sheila still feel guilty because what they did still happened. Even though it wasn't necessarily to Eva Smith, it still happened. But there is the twist at the end. So I apologize if I'm spoiling it for anybody. But when they think they are free, the phone rings. It is the police to tell them that a girl just died by drinking disinfectant and that they are on their way to ask the family questions. So that is the general plot for anyone who hasn't read this yet. So today, what we're really going to focus on is the context. What was happening at the time this was written? And I've split this into two sections. One specific to the writer and another one specific to the characters in the play, because they're two separate bits of context, in my opinion. So focusing first on the writer then. J.B. Priestley was the man who wrote this play. And I guess it's worth saying the reason I've done this is because if you think back to last week's exam session, AO3 isn't just the context, it's also the writer's intentions. Hence why I've done it in a blue W. Think back to our Pete W. curl. The W is for the writer's intentions. So thinking about why Priestley actually wrote this play. Before I even go into what was happening at the time, I just want to really make it clear why he wrote this play. Now, he wrote it in 1945, just after World War II had happened. But it's important to note that this play is set in 1912, just before World War I. So Priestley wanted his audience to reflect on how society has failed during the world wars and how it can be improved. So he uses the play as a moral warning that people must learn from the past and take responsibility for one another. And it's important to remember that because that is the reason he wrote this play. Very much like how Shakespeare wrote Macbeth to warn the audience not to sin, Priestley wrote this to warn the audience to learn from the past and to care for each other. He wanted to promote a society built on fairness, equality, and community, without selfishness and greed from the rich. And so the moral message of this play is to encourage the audience to think about their own role in society. He wanted the audience to leave the theatre reflecting on their own behaviour and how they could do better to help other people. And so it emphasizes the idea that we are members of one body. Every member of society should treat each other with love and respect, and that true justice comes from recognizing our duty to others, not from the physical law itself. And so the goal of this play is to inspire a fairer, more compassionate post-war Britain, where everyone takes social responsibility for each other and moral accountability. So I wanted to begin with that so that we're really clear going into this why he wrote this play. Because he wanted people to come away thinking about their own behavior, realizing that in order to have a better world, we have to care for each other. We have to treat each other with love and respect in order to build a better society. And so he wanted fairness, equality, and community. And that is the moral message of this play. Can I send you these slides? Oh, I forgot to talk to Mr. Suzuki last week. I am going to find a way to send these slides to you at some point, I do promise. Okay, so that's the intention of the play. Let's begin to look at the context, what was actually going on at the time this play was written. So I wanted to start here, the crime genre. Thinking back to Macbeth, that was within the tragic genre. If we think back to just genres in general, this is just the general, I guess, brackets in which a play or a novel is within. So Shakespeare's Macbeth was in the tragic genre, whereas this play is within the crime genre. So An Inspector Calls borrows in elements from the crime and detective genre, especially this classic whodunit style. So if any of you out there classic crime genre fans, such as Agatha Christie, you'll be familiar with these elements. Often crime novels include these things. So you'll find a crime, you'll find a detective, you'll find suspects, motives, evidence, judgment, and then justice and punishment at the end. Except Priestley subverts this traditional crime story. It's not just about who did the crime. It's about why this crime was committed. It's about what can we do to better ourselves as a result of this crime. So he subverts the traditional crime story, and he does this to explore moral and social responsibility. So thinking back to our moral message that I showed you, why did Priestley write this play? Well, everything you're about to see in this session is this here. He does everything to encourage the audience to realize how they wrong other people, to make them think about their own behavior. So rather than just a legal mystery, it's a social and political commentary. He subverts the traditional genre to explore broader moral and social issues, rather than focusing purely on the crime itself. Often you'll find with crime fiction, the focus is on the crime. It's trying to find who did the crime. But in this case, we know who did the crime. So the focus isn't on finding out the murderer because they're all there. The focus is pushing a moral message. So, okay, let's start with the crime. How does Priestley subvert the crime? Well, the real crime is not a traditional crime, but it's a collective moral failure of the Burns and Gerald Croft. So the real crime is not the murder of Eva Smith because she unlived herself. The crime is what they did to cause her to do that. So the focus isn't on who murdered Eva Smith, but on the actions that led to her unaliving herself. So each person's selfish actions lead to her downfall. And so he subverts this idea because they are all responsible. There isn't just one murder. There isn't just one person who committed the murder. It's that they're all responsible. And so Priestley shifts the focus from a who did it to who is responsible, which is a very different retelling. We also get subversions of things like the detective. In normal crime fiction, the detective, again, it'll be like a whodunit. It's trying to find one person to blame for the crime. But the detective here isn't just a physical detective. He's actually a moral judge. He doesn't just want to find who did it. He wants to make them feel bad for doing it. So he's more of a moral judge than he is a traditional detective. And so he guides the investigation and exposes truths about each character's involvement. But the key difference here is that he demands accountability. He doesn't just want to find out who did it, he wants to make them feel bad for doing it, make them learn something from the crime. And so he's a symbol of social justice and a higher moral force. You also get changes in the suspects and the motives. All the characters are guilty, but the thing here is that none of them have a traditional obvious motive. None of them really did it for a reason, they just do it for selfish reasons. And so their reasoning is blind selfishness and a lack of respect for the lives of others. They hurt others to maintain their own social status, wealth, and reputation, which means more to them than the morality of the act. And so the play becomes a question of morality rather than fact and legality. So I hope you're beginning to see that Priestley is really pushing his moral message in this play because they're all responsible and it's not about who did it, it's about why they did it. And they all did it for selfish reasons with no clear motives. You know, in traditional crime, there's normally the big three motives: love, power, and money. But really, none of those three things come into this play. They always did it for selfish reasons because they wanted social status and reputation. And then evidence is also subverted. Normally in crime dramas, you'll get things like forensic evidence, like fingerprints, clues are left behind at the crime scene, the murder weapon. Except in this play, The evidence is a lot more circumstantial than in traditional crime. It relies a lot on subjective recounts rather than objective fact. Eva's journal is the only physical piece of evidence, but it only recounts a subjective experience, and so it cannot be relied upon as 100% accurate truth. So, like I just said, in normal crime, you'll get objective evidence like fingerprints and um, DNA samples and things like that. But in this play, there's none of that. It's all subjective recounts. It's people telling their versions of the story, which we don't know as 100% truth. The photograph of Eva forces the characters to visually confront the people they've hurt, or person they've hurt, sorry. But it's only shown to them individually, so there's no way of knowing it is of the same girl. And most of the evidence comes from the suspects themselves. You also get a subversion of the confession. So normally in crime dramas, the villain will tend to confess towards the end. Except here, the only young characters really are the ones that take moral accountability. However, they do sort of all admit their wrongdoings to some extent. Okay, and then finally, we get subversion of justice, judgment, and punishment. Normally in crime dramas, people will go to court and then they'll get imprisoned or they'll get a murder sentence, depending on when the when the novel is set. But in this case, there is no legal punishment or traditional justice. The punishment is the guilt and the shame they feel for their actions, or the loss of social standing and reputation, but it's more the guilt and the shame. And so emotional and psychological punishment replaces the legal justice to emphasize the moral message of the play. And the audience represent the jury, judging both the characters and themselves. So I guess it's like I said, thinking about the moral message is that Priestley wants the audience to come away from the play thinking about their own actions and how they can better themselves to create a more fair society. And so they represent the jury, not only judging the characters, but themselves and their own actions. And so the guilt and the shame that replaces the legal punishment is there to emphasize this moral message. Do better. Create a fairer society. All of this transforms the detective story into a moral investigation of conscience, class, and social responsibility that encourages the audience to look inwards, reflect on their own behavior, and judge themselves. Okay, so that's the crime genre. But let's look a little bit about the playwright himself, J.B. Priestley. So to understand why he wrote this play, we need to start to look at his life. Now, he was born in Bradford to a working class family. He grew up in an industrial town, one that relied on exports. So a lot of people that lived there were very poor and they lived in terrible conditions. And so he saw first-hand suffering. He also fought in World War II, falling victim to a gas attack and being buried alive by a German shell attack. However, once the war was over, he studied politics at Cambridge University and became a journalist in London. And he went on to host a BBC radio show where he spoke to the British public about community, fairness, and I forgot what I was meant to put there, but it was cancelled by government officials who thought his views were too left-wing. So I guess it's worth noting here that he really believed in community and fairness, except he was censored by the government, who thought that he was promoting too much left-wing ideology. And so he consequently founded his own socialist organization called the Commonwealth Party. But I want to look at how these experiences actually relate to why he wrote this play. And I know there's quite a lot of writing here, so let me read it through. He had first-hand experience of human suffering and inequality. Growing up in Bradford, which was an industrial city, a lot of people were very poor, and it meant a lot of people lived in very bad conditions. And so he saw suffering firsthand. He realized that something had to be done to promote a better society. And again, kind of in the war, he saw many young working class people die, all whilst the wealthy and the powerful stayed safe at home. And so he was convinced that this old class system was corrupt, and he also realized that many of the surviving soldiers of World War II were too poor to afford clothes when they returned home. And so he was outraged by the fact that these men who'd given their lives to fight for the country went back to a country that didn't care about them anymore. And so he felt frustrated about this. And so again, he wanted to write a play that highlighted the need to promote a society where we look after each other and we're respectful to each other. Because he'd lost faith in authority and the upper classes. The show that he made on the BBC, the radio show, he did that to boost national morale. World War II had just happened. People were at a loss. They were feeling very down. The conditions of the country were terrible because we were recovering from a lot of financial debt at that point. And so he made the show to boost morale. Except he uses this play to criticize complacent figures of authority who sit by and encourage suffering out of their own self-interest, like the people who counselled his show. And so he wanted audiences to question power and privilege instead of blindly respecting it, because he believed that society must change and that we must look after each other to prevent further suffering. And so he urges the audience to build a fairer, more cooperative Britain. Ignoring social responsibility leads to catastrophe. And his Socialist Party helped the Labour win an election in 1945, which we'll look at now. So, what was post-World War II life like? Like I said, the play was written in 1945. So the people who were watching this play were people who'd survived World War II. So after World War II, Britain was recovering from devastation because the war had killed millions of people. And so Priestley believed in order to rebuild society, we must all learn to take social responsibility and help each other. Because he thought that was the fastest and best way to rebuild society after World War II. And so in this play, he criticizes the complacency and greed of those rich people who didn't do very much to help the nation recover from the war. So some history for you. The Beveridge Report was a government official document produced in 1942, and it proposed the creation of what we call a welfare state. And it led to the formation of things like the NHS, the state-funded education, national insurance, things that actually benefited society, things that we have now still. And it also legalized protests. So all of these were things that promoted the idea of collective responsibility. And Priestley really wanted to prey on these because he really agreed with these concepts. And so the play challenges the audience to think about how many disasters lay ahead if we don't learn from the past. Okay, quick politics as well, just so we really grasp the writer's intentions. The post-war Labour government was like this. After World War II, Britain faced poverty, unemployment, and social inequality. So in 1945, the Labour Party, led at that time by Clement Attlee, won by a landslide election, which they hadn't done for a very long time. And they began building that welfare state. And the key things that they promoted when they won in 1945 were things like the National Insurance Act, which provided unemployment, sickness, maternity benefits, the Industrial Industries Act, which offered compensation for workers injured at work, the NHS, which gave free healthcare regardless of income or class, nationalisation of major industries that were brought under state ownership to benefit the public rather than private profit. And then support for trade unions, which strengthened collective bargaining and workers' ability to strike. And so when this play was written, collective responsibility was being promoted politically by the Labour Party. So the reason this is important is because audiences who are watching this play, this is their life. This is what they're going through at the time. And so they will have been aware of all of these things. And so Priestley uses these historical events to sort of pray and produce his moral message, to really promote his moral message. Okay, but this play is technically a morality play. So just a bit of history for you as well. Morality plays were things that were quite big in the medieval times. And so they were medieval dramas that were designed specifically to teach moral lessons about right and wrong. And they tended to focus on the 7 deadly sins. And we'll come back to that later. So morality plays tended to include characters who had sinned, who were then punished for those sins, but could be redeemed, sorry, if they'd repented. And so they were Christian-based based religious plays in order to teach lessons about right and wrong, and they intended to guide the audience towards moral self-reflection and spiritual improvement. And the reason I'm telling you this is because The Inspector Calls is technically a morality play. And the reason that is because the inspector acts as this moral judge. He exposes each character's social and ethical failings. Every character of the Burling family and Gerald commits some form of sin. And the play reveals the consequences of this corruption through Eva Smith's death. So some characters, such as Sheila and Eric, show repentance and redemption, while others refuse to change. So we can view this as a morality play. This very similar to these medieval dramas. They focused on sins, and they were there to teach the audience about self-reflection and spiritual improvement. And so Priestley uses the morality play to teach that selfishness leads to suffering, and only through empathy and social responsibility can society improve. The play's structure of confession and judgment forces both characters and audience to confront their own moral choices, as the audience becomes part of the lesson, asked to reflect on their actions and how their actions affect others. And I guess it's worth saying that Priestley revives this medieval morality play, to deliver a much more modern moral message, that true justice comes from conscience, compassion, and collective responsibility. Okay. It's also a well-made play. And those of you who've been to my sessions a while will be familiar with this diagram. All a well-made play is a thing with a dramatic structure that's very carefully crafted, and it often includes suspense, surprise, and a satisfying resolution, typically including an exposition, rising action, climax, and resolution. So this structure that we've seen before. So I wanted to quickly highlight what parts of the play are which parts of the structure of a well-made play. So the exposition is that the Burling family celebrates Sheila's engagement, but tensions bubble into the surface. Characters are presented as unlikable. You then get an inciting incident where the inspector arrives to reveal Eva's death. That sets in motion some rising action, some tension, in which each character is interrogated and their sin is exposed. You then get to the climax where the full truth of Eva Smith's death is revealed. And you get a subverted resolution. But it's this subverted resolution that I want to focus on, because up until this point, the play follows the structure of a normal, well-made play. But contextually, it's important to focus on this resolution, because instead of restoring order like a normal, well-made play, the ending ends in a twist, which creates uncertainty and moral tension. When the Burlings think they're off the hook, the phone call reveals the truth about another death. And so the inspector identity remains a mystery, and the family's future is unresolved. So the effect of that is the audience is left questioning rather than comforted. And so again, it leads us back to the reasoning that he wrote this play, the intentions of the writer. He did this to emphasize the moral message, because he wanted the audience to leave the theatre looking inwards, being self-reflective. And so by not giving this normal tied-up resolution, we can't leave feeling comforted. We feel leaving tense and uncertain. And that's the point of this play. So it's a really interesting subversion of a typical well-made play. And so the effect on the audience is it builds suspense, engagement, but the ambiguous ending forces the audience to reflect morally rather than leave feeling entertained. He really wanted to push this self-reflection of morality. And so Priestley transforms a popular dramatic structure into a tool for social criticism and moral reflection. Okay. So the final thing that we'll cover of the writer is this. Because in an exam, you will have to talk about Priestley's intentions. And I've managed to narrow down 6 intentions I think he had when he wrote this play. So what he wanted the audience to learn. One thing I thought was social responsibility. I think that's the big one. That the idea that we are responsible for each other. He wants the audience to leave knowing this, to realize that our individual actions affect other people, especially those less fortunate. Society only works when people care and act collectively rather than selfishly. And so this directly challenges capitalist ideas of every man for himself. He wants us to leave theatre and do better by other people, not mistreat other people. He also wants us to learn the illusion of respectability, to question how appearance and class can hide immorality. Because the Berlins seem respectable, but their actions are actually quite cruel and self-serving. And so Priestley exposes hypocrisy within the upper and middle classes. Again, to promote respect for the lower classes. He also wants us to learn about the criticism of capitalism and the class system. He saw capitalism as unfair and exploitative, and Mr. Burns' attitude reflects this in his selfish individualism, the fact that a man has to make his own way. And so Priestley wanted audiences to see the need for social reform, that we need fair wages, we need workers' rights, we need welfare support. And so he highlights the issues with the upper classes, the selfishness that they have, in order to show us, the audience, that the way things are in society currently is unfair and exploitative, in order to inspire social reform. He also wanted us to look at generation gaps, this idea of a hope of the future. He shows that younger characters are more open to change, like Sheila and Eric, whereas the older generation refused to learn. Therefore, he wanted young people to see that they can lead social progress. Again, this idea of transforming society. And then also the illusion of time. The play's cynical ending reminds audiences that if people don't change, history will just repeat itself. And so he wanted audiences to reflect and act differently to build a more just society. And then also to take moral and spiritual accountability. You can't escape moral responsibility, even if no one is watching. That's really what he wanted you to take away from this play. Okay. So, the second half then. That was just about the writer and his intentions. Let's talk about the context of the play. Because it was written in 1945, but it's set in 1912. So let's look at what life was like in 1912. Well, we have to consider Edwardian life, which was pre-World War I, about 1901 to 1914. And at that time, Britain was strictly class divided, very much dominated by wealth, status, and privilege, where the upper and middle classes enjoyed comfort, power, while the working class lived in poverty, with very few rights. The Labour Party, the one that won in 1945, was only founded in 1906, and at that time it had very little influence on society. It wasn't until 1945 that they actually won. So that should kind of give you an idea of how unfair society was at this time. There was no promotion of socialism or anything like that. And only men with property could vote. So really, only very rich men were allowed to have a say in society. Very unfair. There was no welfare system. Therefore, no free healthcare, no free education, nothing like that. Unemployment and illness often led to destitution or the workhouse. So there's very poor conditions at that time. And women's roles were limited. Middle upper class women were expected to marry well, while only working class women worked for survival. So a very unfair society. And linking it directly to the play, the Berlin family embodies Edwardian privilege and social complacency, blind to the struggles of people like Eva Smith. The Berlin family are middle class, whereas Gerald Croft, I would say, upper class. And they're very much blind to the struggles of the working class, like Eva Smith. And Mr. Berlin's views, such as a man has to make his own way, reflect capitalist self-interest, very much typical of the middle class in this era. So Eva Smith symbolizes the powerless working class, exploited by those above her. The play exposes the moral failure of Edwardian society, its lack of empathy, equality, and social responsibility. By setting the play in 1912, Priestley allows the audience watching in 1945 to see how the arrogance and inequality led to catastrophe, namely the two world wars and all the suffering it caused. So Priestley uses Edwardian society to criticize a world built on privilege and greed, to urge his audience to build a fairer and more compassionate post-war society. Okay. Now, at that time, well, sorry, after World War One, sorry, Britain was beginning to change. The World War One happened between 1914 and 1918, and it brought with it mass trauma and loss. A lot of people died. So it began to force the country to question traditional hierarchies and values. And the war highlighted the inequality between classes. Ordinary soldiers had fought and died, whilst the rich stayed safe. So Britain entered this period of social unrest, economic hardship, and political change. And so there was a lot of social and political developments at this time. We've talked about the Labour Party. It was made in 1906 and it began to gain support. Now, it didn't win until 1945, but it definitely began to gain a large following because it promoted workers' rights and social reform. And by 1928, all men and women over 21 could vote, which marked a massive step towards democracy and equality. Other sort of general things happened within this time, such as the general strike of 1926, where millions of workers protested poor conditions, which mirrored tensions very much shown by Mr. Burling's factory strike in the play. And historically, this general strike lasted 9 days and it caused the industry to halt. It was a really, really terrible thing for the economy at the time. But it really shows how people were standing up for themselves, or beginning to. This idea of social reform was really beginning to take root in British society at that time. People were moving towards social responsibility. You also get things like the Great Depression happening, which led to widespread poverty and unemployment. And then after World War II, in 1945, the Labour government finally won, and we've just looked at what they did there. And so really what I wanted to show you with this slide is how social responsibility was beginning to take root at this time. And so the audience watching this play would be encouraged to reflect on their own social responsibility and failures in society. Okay, what about social class? Well, social class at the time, in 1912, was structured like this. The upper class were the ones who owned land, the ones that inherited wealth, such as the Crofts. They had high status, very little responsibility. The middle class were the factory owners, the professionals, like the Burlings, who controlled business and labor, and the working class, who were the hardest workers, but got the lowest pay. And they had very little rights. And Eva Smith is our working class woman in this play. Now, they lacked political voice and protection. They didn't have any rights at the time. And so the Burlings represent the selfishness and ignorance of the upper middle class. They're concerned with appearance and reputation, not morality. And Mrs. Burling refuses to see Eva as an individual. Now, Eva Smith symbolizes the dignity of the working class. She suffers, yet shows more morality than her social superiors. So despite her poverty, she refuses to accept stolen money from Eric as an example. So what's really interesting here is Priestley begins to, again, subvert these typical class expectations. The stereotypes are kind of that the rich are nice, caring people, and the poor are really rough and dirty. But actually, Priestley subverts this idea, and he shows that it's actually the lower class who stand up for people, who are kind, who are respectful. But the Burlings are the one who show poor integrity. And so he transverts this idea of social class, playing on stereotypes. And so the key message here is that class creates barriers that prevent empathy and justice. Priestley shows that true worth lies not in wealth or status, but in moral conscience and social responsibility, which is what the lower class, like Eva Smith, have in this play. Okay. We also get this idea of socialism occurring as well. So at the time, Socialism is a political and moral ideology that believes that society should work together for common good rather than selfish individual gain. It supports this idea of collective responsibility, that there should be a fair distribution of wealth and public ownership of key resources. And it opposes capitalism, which prioritizes personal profit over welfare. So Priestley was a huge socialist. He identified as a political socialist. So he believed that there should be a fair distribution of wealth, that people should look after each other rather than hoard wealth like the capitalists did. Priestley was a democratic socialist. He believed that cooperation and equality would build a better society. Having lived through both world wars, he saw how green inequality led to suffering. And through the play, he argues that everyone has a duty of care towards each other, regardless of class or status. And he believed that wealth and privilege created division, hypocrisy, and moral blindness. And the play challenges the idea that social class determines a person's value or morality. So through Inspector Calls, Priestley uses drama to promote socialist ideals, urging audiences to reject selfish capitalism and act with empathy, justice, and collective responsibility. So this idea of socialism is very important in the play. Now, what was an Edwardian family like at this time? Well, society often followed a patriarchal structure, where men were the breadwinners and heads of the household, but women were dependent and domestic. Men were expected to be strong and rational and protect their wives and daughters, whereas women were expected to marry into money, manage the home, host social events, raise children, not work or make decisions. So it's a very unjust and unfair distribution between men and women at the time. Servants were the ones that did all the household chores, and it was the upper and middle class women that rarely cooked or cleaned. And family reputation and social appearance were prioritized by these people. They were more important than honesty and happiness to these kinds of people. And the Burlings reflect that greatly. They care very much about their reputation and social appearance. And they never have to, the women especially never have to work for the money. They're expected to marry, very much like Sheila gets engaged to Gerald Croft. So the Burling family reflect Edwardian values. At the start of the play, the Burlings appear to be respectful, traditional Edwardian family, confident, successful, and socially secure. And Mr. Burling dominates conversations, symbolizing male authority and control. He also reinforces class and gender expectations, constantly correcting others' manners and behavior. Whereas Eric and Sheila are treated as children, not allowed to think or act independently. For example, Eric laughs out of turn and Sheila is scolded and dismissed by her father. And beneath the surface, there's a lot of tension and hypocrisy that undermine this harmonious family illusion. But the thing that's really important is the inspector's impact, because he comes in and disrupts this whole family hierarchy. Eric and Sheila begin to rise and challenge their parents' values, representing how the younger generation's desire is for change. Whereas the older Burlings cling to traditional authority, allowing the younger characters to embrace moral and social awareness. So they do reflect Edwardian values at the time. But again, like much in the play, Priestley subverts the traditional expectations, showing that you can disrupt the family hierarchy, much like he believed you should disrupt the way that we do things in society in order to allow a more just and fair society to take its place. So Priestley uses the Burling family to expose the cracks in Edwardian family life, showing how rigid gender roles, class expectations, and hypocrisy destroy real unity and understanding. So again, linking back to our moral message. Okay, so this is for an Inspector Calls if you've joined late. So we're very nearly done. Let's look at gender. So gender expectations in Edwardian society. Britain in 1912 was again a patriarchal society. Men held the power, they worked, they did politics, and they looked after the family. They were seen as strong and rational and dominant, while the women were expected to be obedient and dependent. The middle and upper class women were expected to marry well and manage the home. Only working class women worked for wages. Women had very few rights as they couldn't vote until 1918, but they had to be over 30 to vote, whereas in 1928, that was lowered to 21 years old. So when this play was set, women could not vote. And in the play, we see these ripples sort of happening because the Berlings reflect traditional gender hierarchies. They see, or rather, Mr. Berling sees himself as the protector, the decision maker. He's the breadwinner, the worker. Whereas Mrs. Berling enforces strict ideas of feminine respectability. She hosts parties and events. She doesn't cook or clean. Sheila is treated as a child, as fragile. Her role is to marry into a richer family. And Eric and Gerald's behavior shows the double standards that men enjoyed, that their mistakes are excused whilst Edith Smith suffers. And Edith Smith represents the struggles of the working class woman facing both class and gender oppression. So, gender expectations of the time then. Thinking about their domestic role, they were expected to be quiet, obedient, agreeable, whereas the men could go out, they could work and be the breadwinners, whereas women were wrongly believed to be less intelligent, almost unfit for politics or work. Women were trained in feminine accomplishments like embroidery and dancing because their role was to attract a husband. And upper class women managed servants, like working class women often had long work hours for low pay. They depended a lot on men. A woman's social standing came from her husband. She relied on him for money, respect, and security. The women couldn't vote, serve on juries, or hold respected jobs. They were denied equal pay and financial independence. And so, yeah, it was very unfair patriarchal society. Marriage and control. At that time, divorce was rare, and it was actually socially shamed. If a woman got divorced from her husband, she would be very unlikely to remarry because she would be seen as destitute. Now, what's really bad is that domestic and sexual violence were actually not considered legal crimes at the time. And so women had no legal protection. And that's important for Eric in the play, because Eric does assault Eva Smith. And even if she had gone to the police, nothing would have been done about it because it wasn't a legal crime. And so it's really unfair that that is the case. They also weren't allowed to perform abortions legally. Thinking again about Eric in the play, he gets Eva Smith pregnant, except she's forced to keep the baby unless she wants to undergo an illegal abortive act. And so many women felt that they were forced to perform dangerous procedures on themselves. And so all of that sort of links to Eric down at the bottom of the play. And it shows really how unfair Eva's life was as a low-class woman. We also get this idea of fallen women, women who were seen as having lost their innocence, like prostitutes and mistresses and unmarried mothers. They got this label at the time of fallen women. They were condemned and ostracized by society, but also romanticized by men as objects for pity or desire, very much like Gerald does to Eva Smith. He sees her as this fallen woman, but he takes advantage of her because he almost romanticizes this idea that she's easy or something like that. And so this idea of fallen women links to moral and religious views. It comes from this idea of the Victorian times, or it came from the Victorian times, that linked women to purity. Her worth was very much tied to how pure and innocent she was. And so at the time, you got charitable groups which tried to rescue these women through religious teachings and respectable work, very much like how Mrs. Berling tries to rescue lower class women. So society punished fallen women but praised the men who exploited them. And so this very much links to Mrs. Berling's idea of Eva Smith. She saw her as a fallen woman and tried to rescue her by religious teachings. which is ironic because that almost suggests that it's her fault. But we know, ironically, through the moral message of the play, that her unaliving is not her fault because the play looks at who's responsible. And so Priestley's critique. In Inspector Calls, Eva Smith represents the fallen woman, judged by others but morally stronger than those who condemn her. So Priestley exposes the hypocrisy and exploitation behind gentleman's chivalry. He shows how women's vulnerability was created by a patriarchal system that denied them respect, power, and compassion. So the final thing I'll say about women then is this idea of suffrage. You probably have learned in school about the suffragettes. They were a political group who fought for women's rights, especially to help them get the vote. And so the suffrage movement began in the 19th century, but grew really powerful in 1912, or by 1912. Groups like the Women's Social and Political Union were led by suffragettes who demanded votes for women through petitions, marches, and protests. And when ignored, they turned to civil disobedience. They would undergo violent acts like window smashing, arson, and hunger strikes. They did quite a lot of extreme things in order to get the attention of political parties and men. But that just shows you how bad conditions were. If they were willing to go to that extent to commit illegal crimes and to even injure themselves, it really shows you how desperate they were for equality and to be seen. Opposition and struggle. Many, including Prime Minister Asquith, opposed women's suffrage, claiming it would make women neglect their roles as wives and mothers. Whereas anti-suffrage groups argued politics would corrupt women. And so there was early bills produced by government that offered limited rights to wealthy women. Except this legacy led to change. Despite resistance, the movement raised awareness of women's rights and challenged patriarchal norms. And by 1918, some women gained the vote. And by 1928, all women over 28 could vote. They had suffrage. And that's important, again, if we're thinking about Eva Smith. Okay, so what was Priestley's message about gender? Well, he uses Sheila's transformation to almost show hope for gender equality and moral awareness. She begins as naive, but grows confident, questioning her family's values and Gerald's actions. So she is almost symbolic of the suffragettes at the time. This is Sheila. She represents everything that the suffragettes stood for. And through Eva Smith's story, Priestley highlights her vulnerability of women in a male-dominated society exploited by men and ignored by institutions. And the play challenges the audience to recognize the injustice of gender inequality and to value women's independence and moral strength. And so we sympathize with Eva because it conveys the moral message by appealing emotionally to the audience. So Priestley uses gender roles to expose the sexism of Edwardian society, showing that progress depends on empowering women to think, speak, and act for themselves. So the very final piece of context to go through for this play, and then we've done the context. Going back to this idea of a morality play, we saw that the morality play originally was to do with the 7 deadly sins. So morality plays follow flawed characters who have sinned and have a chance of redemption. Each member of the Burling family has committed at least one deadly sin from the Bible, and the inspector acts as a moral judge, like a biblical angel, offering each character the opportunity to confess and change. And those who accept guilt show potential for redemption, while the others are spiritually condemned. Now, I want to look at the characters, because each of them commits a 7 deadly sin. And the sins are pride. Mr. Burling, Mrs. Burling, and Sheila all show pride because they're obsessed with status, reputation, and appearances. Mr. Burling is obsessed with knowing the police inspector. Mrs. Burling is obsessed with her reputation in the charity. And Sheila accuses Eva of being rude to her out of fear of how she's perceived in society. So they're all associated with pride. Greed. Mr. Burling prioritizes profit over people. He cares more about money than he does about treating people with fairness. So he fires Eva for demanding fair pay. Wrath. This is Mrs. Burling and Eric. They're both cold and angry and violent towards Eva. So wrath means violence, whether that's spoken or physical. Envy is jealousy. So Sheila and Gerald are both jealous, which leads to Eva's dismissal and Gerald's desire for Eva. Lust. Eric and Gerald both show lust for Eva Smith. They exploit her physically for personal pleasure, reflecting male privilege at the time and moral weakness. The gluttony, that's again Mr. Burling. He's self-indulgent. He values material things over, again, the welfare of others. And then the sloth. This is the family as a whole. None of them act to right their wrongdoings. Only Sheila and Eric show genuine remorse or change. And so they can all be accused of sloth. So the play shows how moral corruption and selfishness leads to suffering and destruction. The inspector gives each character and the audience a chance to recognize their sins and seek redemption. And Priestley transforms a Christian idea into a modern moral warning about social responsibility and compassion. So through the seven deadly sins, Priestley exposes humanity's moral failings, urging repentance, change, and collective conscience before it's too late. So by having the characters each commit a sin, it allows the audience to be self-reflective and realize the wrongdoings of the characters and how that could inform their own lives. So that is the context. I'll leave you on this. Like I did with Macbeth, there are themes of this play. And in the exam, you could get asked about any one of these. Some of them have come up already. Um, so like I talked about last week in my exam session, you tend to get questions mostly on character and themes, but you can get them on context as well. And so it's worth knowing these themes so that you know what could come up for you in an exam. And we're going to cover these themes as we go through the AO1 and AO2 of Inspector Calls. So I'm not going to cover them today, but I will be covering them at a later date. So you get stuff like social responsibility. Now that has come up in an exam already. Social class, capitalism versus socialism. Gender has come up already in an exam. Generational conflict has come up in an exam already. So that's the conflict between the old and the young. Morality and guilt, justice and judgment, power, learning has come up in an exam already. So that any of these could come up for you in an exam. Now, the nice thing about an Inspector Calls is that you get a choice of question, and one of them will tend to be character, and one of them will tend to be theme related, but that is not always the case. So yeah, these are worth learning. Okay, that is it from me today. I know context is a little boring, but we need to know it so we understand the play. And I'll keep like I have done with Macbeth. We'll keep coming back to these as we analyze quotes and characters. Okay, right. I'm going to stay around for 2 more minutes to answer any questions that anyone might have. But otherwise, thank you for coming. Enjoy your week. And I will try and find a way to get these slides sent to you. Okay, if no one has any questions, I'll let you all go.